The Ochelli Effect is sponsored by WallStreetWindow.com and listeners like you.
And now, the most underrated voice in all media, Chuck Ochelli.
May 1, 2024, allegedly, according to that thing we call a calendar. This, the Ochelli Effect, you listening to us most likely on a podcast, a podcatcher, whatever, through the feed later on. But we do broadcast live on Ochelli.com and Ochelli.com radio, on your radio apps and all that good stuff on your fondle slab of choice. So either way, guess what? It is a Woden's Day, Wednesday, middle of the week. Some people call it hump day. It is what it is. But for me, every other week, it's a great chance to sit down with author, researcher, historian, and overall great guy, Larry Hancock. You go to larry-hancock.com, and if welcome to the internet. Welcome to the JFK research community. Welcome to the show. You never heard of Larry before. Go to larry-hancock.com and you'll see many things that he has written, not just a blog, but a great number of books that take up a lot of room on my bookshelf. Surprise Attack, Shadow Warfare, Creating Chaos. Those are books not even focused on the JFK case. Today, we're going to focus on the JFK case, and I'm happy to have Larry Hancock with me. So, when we're going to go on to a particular aspect of the case, by the way, a fairly controversial one. What a surprise there. Also, we got to discuss this guy that you might have never heard of, too. Welcome to Planet Earth once again, Lee Harvey Oswald. And why do we have to discuss him? Well, a lot of different reasons. Not only is he the alleged assassin and all that, but anyway, go to larry-hancock.com, follow his blog, and in the weeks and months to come, we're going to be talking about JFK Lancer, the conference this year. Larry might be participating with it via remote, I think, but we'll see what happens. You never know what could happen by the time we get to November. I'm going to be the MC there again, but again, not focusing on that tonight necessarily, although the JFK case is where we're going on this particular Wednesday. Larry, first off, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing fine, Chuck. Of course, I'm shocked by the thought that there might be controversy in this subject. Okay. Yeah. I'm taken aback. Not sure how to deal with that.
Yeah, it's possible that there are differing opinions, regarding the evidence that is publicly known, the special evidence that some people claim to have, the interesting insights that individuals do have. We could begin with the likes of Ed Lopez. We could start with what actually happened in Mexico City only a few weeks prior to the assassination. And this character Oswald, the historical Oswald, okay, not going to go into is there more than one guy and all that. No, let's stick to the facts. Let's stick to the thing that floated around, right? Not instantaneously. I don't remember it coming out that weekend. But, shortly after the assassination, not only did they, parade out the clips from WDSU TV, Latin Listening Post, Oswald had been on the radio, Fair Play for Cuba Committee, all that kind of stuff. But guess what was going on internally? J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, at that time being J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI being, interchangeable in a sentence, they were looking into this circumstance where Lee Harvey Oswald had made a trip to Mexico City and done some strange things. At one point asking to go to Cuba. At another point, allegedly, pulling out a gun and putting it on the desk at a consulate. Pretty interesting behavior, okay, from a guy who had already defected to the Soviet Union, but not really, who had gone to Minsk, lived there for a while, had wanted to go to Russia and then really badly wanted to come home. And here he is in Mexico City in 1963. Or did he actually get there? Let's begin with that. And I thought that for a long time, by the way, Larry, that maybe this was a complete fabrication. Maybe somebody made this up to simply make Lee Harvey Oswald look like the screaming red communist that would have made a lot more sense, being that he killed the president of the United States, if you wanted to push that narrative. I mean, for somebody to fabricate a trip to Mexico City, for somebody to fabricate attempts to leave the United States once again, to defect, all of those things kind of made sense. And J. Edgar Hoover felt as though he had been lied to regarding those circumstances. And oh, by the way, do we have photographs? Do we have phone calls? Do we have a paper trail regarding this interesting trip? Maybe we should begin with the bare facts on this, Larry, and tell us what should be the introduction to Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City just a few weeks before November 22nd of 1963.
Well, I think I'd start with two things, Chuck. As we often talk about, there is context, and you have to the context of Oswald and Mexico City, considering what he purportedly went there to do. He went there to do in conjunction with two things that he had been doing all year long. Okay. And so in terms of consistency, and I'm with you. Until I really started digging into this again for myself, I didn't realize how much that other people had written that I was taking for granted that I'd never gone back to the source information on. But so there's context that's very important. There's context. You actually have to begin with December 1962, which is when Oswald starts his communication again with the Russian embassy in New York City. And all throughout the year of 1963, there is correspondence between Marina Oswald and the Russian embassy, and between Lee Oswald and the Russian embassy, about Marina and June, the child, going back to Russia, about Oswald going back to Russia separately from them. And then later, when Marina gets pregnant, another real push to urgency for Marina to get back to the USSR so that the new baby is actually born in Russia. This is context that we often ignore. I think I was surprised to find that, while she was in the United States, Marina had written and followed all the procedures required by the Soviet Union to retain her citizenship. Mm-hmm. She had written and filed changes of addresses. She had began writing in February of 1963 about the process for returning to the USSR. And I think that's some backstory that we often miss.
Well, let me ask you a question about that real fast, because let's put the babies in context, right? You have June, right, who is born in the Soviet Union, and Marina brings her with her when she comes to America with Oswald, right?
Right.
And then she's pregnant with the baby that will become Rachel Oswald. And urgently she'd like to return to the Soviet Union. She's not happy here in America. Maybe she's really not happy with being with Oswald in America. Things are not going well. We famously know about that from some authors that maybe we don't really like. We definitely get accounts in the Marina and Lee book, right? The journalist that had run into Oswald in the Soviet Union, later on writing the book with Marina directly. So we get plenty of an idea that maybe Marina's unhappy here, not just unhappy in her marriage, but maybe just unhappy in America too, and would like to return home, and indeed would like to have her other child also born in the Soviet Union. I mean, it's the reverse of the anchor baby thing that people talk about, right? Yeah. Where it's like, I don't want my kids born in America. I want to go back home where at least I understand how things work. And who knows, maybe I can get rid of this husband I'm not too thrilled with. And he'd like to go back, even separately. And nobody ever brings that up at all when they start talking about this series of events that leads to what happens in Mexico City. But also in context, right? You have his Fair Play for Cuba Committee stuff. You have him writing to, I think, the Communist Party. You have him writing to a bunch of people about different things where he feels as though he's being targeted. He's complaining about the FBI and Hosty, and Hosty's visiting him. All these things are going on. swirling around Oswald, and then he decides to make this trip to Mexico, right? And again, as I said, it's only a few weeks before, literally, he goes to Mexico in October, and the dates are a little questionable. Somebody's got a couple of different ideas about dates. But if you actually look at the evidence and you take it at face value, you have some dates here you can work with. You have a couple of points that you can work with and say Oswald is there just slightly over 3 weeks before the assassination, right?
Right. And he's coming now. Again, that backstory probably, again, you pointed out, Oswald clearly, whatever Marina is doing, and there is a real backstory there. It's ambivalence. There are times when she gets along with Oswald. There's times when she doesn't. Certainly, America never worked out to be what she imagined it to be. And even when people actually try to persuade her separately, like to leave Oswald, and can they help her do something to stay in the U.S., she goes back and forth. And people kind of get disgusted with her over that, like, okay. And eventually in one of her final letters to the Soviet Union explaining her position, as recently as October, November, she's saying, look, I can't get a job here. If I was back in Russia, I'm trained as a pharmacist assistant. I can get a job there, So clearly there's some ambivalence. But Oswald, if you want to set a starting point, clearly Oswald begins taking a turn towards someplace else, whether it's Russia, whether it's Cuba. As you say, he applies for a new passport in June. You don't apply for a new passport unless you're thinking about going somewhere, right?
Well, and in all fairness, when you're in a turbulent relationship, this is not uncommon what's going on here, where you got back and forth. You got one party seeing it one way, one party seeing it another way. This is not, the kind of thing that is made up really on the side of the lone nut theorists, right? Who say that, look, he was just this disenchanted, malcontent, kind of looks that way. He's not happy anywhere he's going. He can't seem to make any situation work out the way he wants it to. So this is not out of character considering the inconsistent level of contentment that Oswald himself is seeking and finding as he goes from place to place. And indeed, even having been in the Soviet Union, he wasn't happy there. He had to come back here. Now he's not happy here. He wants to go back there. They're moving around. This is not actually outside of the realm of what would be normal in a circumstance like this, even if the names weren't Marina and Lee Oswald. Okay. So I'm just saying it's not not an uncommon thing. Go ahead.
And even when he's successful in a way, he's not. I mean, and by the way, it's always important to remember something he said to his friend de Mohrenschildt. And Oswald really said, I know that I'm looking for something that I'm probably never going to find. Because de Mohrenschildt had kind of joked with him about, you're an idealist, you want something that's just not going to happen. And Oswald actually recognized that to some extent. But if you look at his activity, two major areas of his activity in New Orleans, he actually does achieve a certain amount of fame, visibility, recognition for his support for Cuba and for Castro. I mean, up to that point in time, he demonstrated in Dallas. He's been writing letters, but he's kind of a public non-entity. By the time he gets through in New Orleans, he's known. There's a record. There's media record. He's been on TV. He's been in TV interviews, radio interviews. He's been in the paper. But even then, where do you go next? Because he can't get a job. By this time, his dishonorable discharge has caught up with him. And if you look at his job application situation, it just gets worse and worse. Right. He has no references. If anybody checks out his background and his other jobs, he's not going to get any recommendations. There's this problem with being associated with supporting leftist causes. This is not a good place for anybody to be who's looking for work. So when we see him in New Orleans, here's Marina, who is pregnant, is going to have a baby in a few months. He doesn't have a job. He has no prospects of getting a job. You know, obviously he's looking for outlets. You know, what am I going to do next? Yeah, I made myself famous as a Castro supporter, but what do I do next?
Right. It hasn't helped him with his inconsistent living circumstance. It hasn't helped him with his inconsistent job circumstance. None of that stuff has been helped here. So
it might play in Cuba, but it's not playing in the U.S., right?
Especially not in a place like New Orleans, where, quite honestly, I mean, the general consensus is not going to be completely thrilled with left-wing causes, it looks like to me. I mean, maybe I'm taking that out of context, but it seems like
you're right, and that's part of his problem. When he wrote to the Fair Play for Cuba committee, they actually advised him not to try to start a chapter because it's not a good place for pro-Castro people.
The location.
The interesting thing is, so they wrote back a letter and told him that, kind of like, we'll send you literature, but this would be a mistake on your part. For the rest of the summer, he continues writing to them. He never gets another response from them. Okay? Oswald is writing people that he's not getting responses to. He's writing to the Socialist Workers' Party. He's writing to Communist Party USA. I mean, if you wanted a paper trail to incriminate the man, all you've got to do, I don't need for him to go to Mexico. All I've got to do is pull out the letter that says, I'm really wholeheartedly support, this is to the Communist Party USA, our cause, and should I go underground? You want a smoking gun, there you go. That's already been written before he does anything else. So he's done a lot of outreach, but even to the people that you think might support him, they're hesitant, Right. They know their mail is being monitored by the FBI, right? Oswald, as early as the fall of 1962, knew that his mail was being opened and monitored. Right. Okay? Which is an interesting thing. So, does that make him a little bit crazy? Does he protest to the post office? Yeah. But even these people, the people at the magazines he's writing to, like the Socialist Worker Party magazine, when they're interviewed after the fact, they're going, yeah, we actually had letters on the file from this guy, and we didn't want him. People are monitoring my mail, and, we don't want the kind of thing. We want very neutral, supportive, we don't want anything radical associated with us. So there he is in New Orleans, and in a way he's been successful. He's built a public resume. But what's he going to do next? And I think that's what we often forget. What would Oswald do next? He's told Marina and he's told Ruth Payne that he's going to have to look for work somewhere else. This isn't working. He might go to the East Coast. He might go to Houston, whatever. But it's already been made clear he's going to have to leave New Orleans and go somewhere. Right. He's going to have to go somewhere. The only question is, where does he go? And there's no discussion with anybody about him immediately. He's not going to follow along with Marina and Ruth back to Dallas, right? For the baby to be born. That's been clear. So he's going to be going somewhere. I think we have to have that as the backstory. Where there was going to be Mexico, we're going to find him somewhere other than New Orleans.
Right, because it just wasn't working out. Okay. So, but meanwhile, Marina and the baby, and now, she's going to be pregnant, so she needs a place to be, and that might be a separate issue from him. So there you have it. Okay, so he goes to Dallas, and he's not there that long, right? Texas, I should say. He's not there that long. But then we have this trip. So where do we begin with the trip?
We don't actually know that he goes to Texas.
Oh, okay.
There's nothing that shows him. Okay, I should not say that's incorrect since I've written something different. As part of the official record, as far as correspondence with Marina or Ruth or anything, there are reported sightings of him in Texas. Okay, one in the Houston area, one in the Dallas area. So there are sightings, but officially he doesn't really come back on the radar with a paper trail until he shows up at the YMCA in October in Dallas. And actually, even when he shows up back in Dallas, the interesting thing is he registers at the Y, and he actually starts job hunting before he even contacts Marina. But we don't have any travel or anything that shows him, he's in New Orleans, and then weeks later he's in Dallas.
Right. No, fair enough. And look, he's looking for a place to land, and it's not going to be with Marina, but he's somewhat nearby, so maybe he can come visit. Maybe that's coming into his mind, but obviously he's got to figure out a way to earn a living. So he's trying to do that right away. He's going to the temp agencies and all that. And then we have this, situation. How did he get the job at the book depository? We've been over that. We don't need to lay that out again. But he ends up with that job at a certain point. But how does this Mexico City trip, come on the radar? How does it appear in the record?
That's a place where we actually do have a paper trail. I mean, we have, again, for some reason, we usually view it as if it all comes about after the assassination. But we have a paper trail of correspondence between the Mexico City CIA station and CIA headquarters, who copies parts of that messaging to several other agencies. And that paper trail, which begins in October, about 8 days after he's, purportedly left Mexico City, the paper trail says there's been an American here. He's been at the Russian embassy, and we have identified him as Lee Harvey Oswald.
Right.
Now, the interesting part of that paper trail is it's all about Oswald in Mexico City at the Russian embassy. And this is where the nightmare begins, in essence, because even though that paper trail is solid, we then generate a whole series of back and forth messages. Mexico City station is asking about information on Lee Harvey Oswald, and headquarters sends them back some information and copies other people. We actually have a document that says right at the time of Lee Oswald, like that time in October when he's there, Mexico City not only notified headquarters about him being at the Russian embassy, they notified other staff in Mexico City, the legat, who in any diplomatic station is the FBI representative. That's just the way it works. So the FBI guy in Mexico City has been notified he was there. The ambassador has been notified he's been there. There's a big stir in Mexico City because Lee Harvey Oswald has been there and he's been at the Russian embassy. So that is going on over the weeks prior to the assassination. What gets to be our biggest nightmare is some things that the CIA starts doing in terms of compartmentalizing information, not only from Mexico City station, but from the FBI. And the big thing that they start doing is not sharing information about what Oswald was doing in New Orleans, about Oswald's trip to the Cuban and visits to the Cuban, about his FPCC activities. That all this information is shielded, and it's taken literally decades for us to find out how badly compartmentalized it was. It's only through Simpich's work, Morley's work, some other people's work. Now we even know, we're beginning to know reasons for that, including the fact that the CIA was concerned that there was a leak inside the FBI office in Mexico City. So there are all sorts of game. But one of the things I wanted to point out, Chuck, is we had none of that information. We were not able to look at the complexity of what was going on around this Oswald story in Mexico City, probably until certainly within the past 10 years.
Right.
So nothing that anybody wrote, nothing that I wrote, nothing that Peter Dale Scott wrote. Earlier you were into this, the worse it was because the less information you had. And so I think that's an important thing when we look back on the evolving story of Oswald in Mexico City is the good news is we know a lot more context now than we did before. Does that make it simpler? No, it makes it more complex.
Right. And look, it's not just about the authors, because even in an official capacity, Ed Lopez, Dan Hardaway, they get sent down there to go find out what happened. What went on here regarding his visits. And that was during the House Select Committee on Assassinations, right? They send those two down there to go find things out. And although that report remained partially classified or completely classified for many years, even when we've gotten it now, it's still kind of confusing.
Oh, it's more, and that's great to point that out, because Lopez and the people that were working on it, here's one of the major problems. Mm-hmm. The first CIA officer that was designated to do a report on Oswald in Mexico City became actually very suspicious about what was going on within the CIA because the stories were so inconsistent, okay, and way too complex. And there were a lot of holes and a lot of contradictions. He got pulled off that job and replaced by James Angleton. Angleton is one of our primary suspects in having made this the nightmare it is in terms of compartmentalization, because he was the guy that was controlling Oswald's file and compartmentalizing information in Oswald's file. And it's literally the people working for him that was filtering this information I was just talking about. So, of course, Lopez has come to understand you can't trust any of that. When the HSCA wrote their summary report that went along with his work, they literally said, it is so bad. The IG lied to us about practices in Mexico City. We don't trust the CIA documents. We found an internal CIA document that says everything that David Phillips told us about Oswald in Mexico City is incorrect because Phillips didn't know what was really going on. It's like, good Lord, if Phillips didn't know what was going on, who knew what about anything? So you're absolutely right. It's not just the authors. It's the investigation itself that started deconstructing this mess that, as you and I have talked earlier, a lot of what's going on here is stuff going on in the CIA about Oswald's appearance in Mexico City, which has very little to do with what he was actually doing there himself. Because his visits, he was only there for a few days. Right. That visit to the Russian embassy was relatively short. It's just parsing out this complexity of what got overlaid after the fact, which leads to the big question of why was the CIA making it so complex? What else was going on that was thrown into this mix?
Right, and it had to be pretty bad because we got greeted with those ridiculous pictures, right? This is Lee Oswald, outside of the embassy / consulate, which they are two different facilities, but they're on the same premises. So let's keep that straight. And here's a picture of him. And meanwhile, that is clearly not the guy that we know to be Lee Harvey Oswald. So what happens here? The CIA's got pictures of the wrong guy?
You've got to wonder. It's sort of like the Mexico City operation in terms of surveillance and monitoring, and it is the crown jewel of the agency. There is no place on earth that has more assets devoted to surveillance and monitoring than Mexico City, and much of that is because of this covert relationship with the Mexican president, who has given the CIA carte blanche to do everything they want to do in Mexico City as long as they share their information with him, which, of course, is one of the crown jewels of the CIA's operation. But this is the place where we got better resources than any place else in the U.S. world. Okay, and Oswald supposedly enters the Cuban embassy, the Cuban consulate 3 times,
right,
the Russian embassy twice, and we don't have a picture. Okay, we don't have a picture. He's monitored multiple times. We know that there's a tap on the Cuban consulate line.
Right.
Okay, a local tap. We know there's a tap on the Russian embassy line, a local tap. And we know beyond all of that, there's this huge facility with 24 operators monitoring all the phone calls through the diplomatic facilities, through a centralized switching facility, staffed by Mexican personnel, watched over by the Mexican DFS, the federal police, who are doing their own recordings and transcripts. So we got local tapes, we got local monitors, we got centralized, and in the end, what do we have? We have nothing. We have no tapes with voices on them that we can check, even though I think, and I will maintain throughout, that about the only people I can trust in this whole game are the Tarasovs, who were the transcribers working for the CIA, and who themselves got a bit confused because they didn't handle all the intercepts.
Right.
Some were done locally at but them, when they say something, I tend to believe it because they say, I listened to this, I wrote that down. At least you got a first party statement. But no, you're right, Chuck. It's agonizing. If you were writing a performance review of the Mexico City station, you would have to say, you people suck.
Yeah, because I can't reliably track, even when you're talking about, the whole thing with the Tarasovs, and the tapes. You've got a guy on there that's speaking Spanish really well. And to my knowledge, Oswald doesn't have that great of a command of Spanish. We have a guy with a different accent, which, I don't know what's happening with some of these tapes. Yeah.
And that gets one of the things I've been working really hard to do, and we've talked about it, and what we do in the book, that we're going to offer up is a deconstruction of all of those intercepts and who really heard what and who transcribed what. And one of the problems being is the Tarasovs, of course, only of 7 purported calls that the CIA said Oswald might have been involved with.
Right.
They only listened to and transcribed 3.
Yeah.
And they were very clear that the calls that they heard were in English. That they heard no broken Russian. They made no remarks about broken Russian, which leads one to believe that stuff came from the Central Switching Center or elsewhere. But at least their story is quite consistent. And Mr. Tarasov said, the last call that he heard in which Oswald's name was actually mentioned was a caller that he'd heard a few days before in another call. So at least that part can be helpful. But yeah, they're clearly inconsistent. That's one of the things that drove Lopez nuts, because he had to face the fact that the Mexico City station was giving its own version of these things.
Right.
And the Tarasovs and the Tarasovs were never interviewed. In fact, the CIA blocked the Tarasovs from being interviewed by the Warren Commission, just as they blocked Duran. So we have to face the fact that for whatever reason, the CIA blocked the primary sources who could have resolved all of our questions, the Tarasovs and Duran, from being approached by or interviewed by the Warren Commission.
Which, again, it just adds to the pile of problems here. Okay.
Yeah. So, yes, it does.
And this is why, like I said, for a long time, I concluded that it doesn't seem to be a reliable story that he was even really there. Because outside of, to my mind, outside of the fact that somebody had brought a picture of Oswald there, because there's a photograph that ends up there with, along with the process of him trying to get the passport, right? and there's this passport photograph that appears to be legitimate. And that's it. To me, everything else was all up in the air. I brought up the whole thing about him bringing in the gun, into the Russian consulate. Oh, and by the way, during one of these visits or phone calls, I forget which, I think the consulate was not even open to the public.
That relates to the so-called impersonation call.
Mm-hmm.
And neither the Cuban consulate or the Soviet embassy was open on Saturday.
Right.
Now, both the Soviet Guard and Soviet personnel at the embassy have stated that Oswald did show up at their embassy on Saturday and got the attention of a guard and was, I won't say, was agitated. Like, okay, I've got to see somebody. It's urgent, whatever. And that he did manage, there were embassy staff there. I mean, on a Saturday, actually, totally different story. But yeah, it was closed. What the other side of that story is, certainly that's a reasonable enough story. At least that's consistent. The Cuban consulate, from whence the telephone call was made after that, was closed, and Sylvia Duran was adamant that the consulate was closed. So was their staff was adamant that it was closed, and Duran, of course, was adamant that she had not made a call with Lee Oswald to the Soviet embassy on that Saturday. Which so again, that's just another. You run into confusion, contention at all times in this story because there are other things going on, and I have things to offer on that call. I don't think there's any possibility that call was not an impersonation. The only question is who and why made it, and I will get into the fact that actually such a call being made by the CIA itself would not have been all that unusual. It's referred to as a pretext call when you're trying to find out and identify that the CIA had done that on multiple occasions before even Lopez found this out, that if somebody showed up at the Cuban embassy or the Russian embassy that they couldn't identify, one of their standard practices was to make a pretext call to the embassy or consulate representing that themselves as that person, not naming themselves, but trying to fish out the name or description or something about the person to help them. Standard pretext call.
Okay. So now that we've gone through all this, Larry, and, and some people are listening to this going, geez, now I'm more confused than I was. All right, let's take a step back. How do we lay this story out? How would you explain this? And I know you're going to do this in the book, and you've already talked about breaking down the recordings and, what actually happened there and stuff like that. But give us a general overview of this.
Well, let's give you Larry's simplistic, life is simpler than we tend to make it response.
Please. Yeah.
Lee Harvey Oswald had decided, probably as early as Dallas, when he left Dallas and went to New Orleans, that his attention was focused on Cuba. And I think Marina says that, his letter writing says that, everything about Oswald says that he had transferred his ambitions from the Russian system to the Cuban system. So Oswald was, I don't want to use the word obsessed, but his real, as said earlier, when his goal had been to get into Russia and see it for himself, his goal was to get to Cuba. Okay. So we have kind of two goals playing here. One goal, it relates to Marina and Russia. The other goal relates to Lee and Cuba. But so I don't find it hard at all to believe that he was exploring any options that he had or could find to get to Cuba. Now, okay, so as we just discussed earlier, he's out of a job, he's at loose ends, he's going to be going someplace. One of the interesting places and persons he contacts is a fellow in Houston that he's come across, that he's contacted, that is involved with maritime activities, shipping and that sort of thing. There's evidence that he actually even did that in New Orleans. Speculation would be that he was exploring the possibility of getting a job on a ship or with a line that ultimately would take him to Cuba. I mean, he couldn't fly there directly. That was not permitted. It was illegal to go there directly. Even his passport is marked, his new passport he's got, that it's not legal to travel directly to Cuba. The only way that you can get to Cuba is to go overseas or offshore and come back to Cuba. You can't go there directly from the U.S. You're going to have to go indirectly. And quite frankly, Oswald was quite aware of the fact, because this was standard FPCC practice. FPC student members had on a number of occasions managed to go to and from Cuba through Mexico City. The standard travel route from the U.S. was to go to Mexico City and get permission to enter Cuba and go to Cuba that way. So one of the options that was obviously facing him was going to Mexico and seeing if he couldn't get into Cuba. Staying in Cuba would be a challenge, but, you know, he's been through this whole thing before. Right. He went to Russia and ended up going through the drama of actually slitting his own wrist to stay in Russia. You know, he's probably prepared. He's got a much better resume now to go to Cuba than he had to go to Russia. So just as part of a backstory, a jumping up point, the fact that you would find him exercising an option to go to Mexico City to try to use that as a transit point to Cuba, leveraging Marina's return, you know, and actually what he told the Cubans was that's why he wanted to be there. He wanted to get to Cuba as part of his effort to return his wife and very probably himself to Russia. That's the story. That was the story he started to sell and presented at both the consulate and the embassy.
Right. This would be an intermediary step to get her back home. Now, as to whether he remains in Cuba or not, that's up in the air, but he might be more welcome there because of his FPCC activities, etc. This seems to be the thing.
And he's an American. Quite frankly, in Cuba, he can be an American defector with some credentials. I mean, he has been an activist. He's been a champion in Cuba. If he could get in Cuba, he's got a marketable story, right, much more than when he went to Russia.
Right, so he could be a notable, as somebody who defected from the U.S. to Cuba. You know, it's a smaller place, bottom line. Okay, so all of this starts to make more sense, but what about the proof itself that he's there, right? What do we have to work with here?
Well, one of the interesting things is when we ask that question, as I said, the proof that we have there is we have a whole series of correspondence internally within Mexico City, back to CIA headquarters back to Mexico City, copied to the FBI, several other agencies. All this happens before the assassination. So I guess in terms of we demand a lot of evidence that was there because all kinds of questions have been raised, like, well, if he was there, why'd you show up? But the actual paper trail, if you want to ask that paper trail was there and in place and in multiple offices weeks before the assassination. There's paper spread around in a dozen different places talking about Lee Oswald being in Mexico City and having been identified in Mexico City. The only time that it gets to be a thing is after the fact. Everybody, well, of course we want to have proof, and the problem is then the question arises, oh, well, people said that there were tapes and there were other people and he was impersonated. Then I'm just saying, before the assassination, this wasn't a real question. The paper trail shows that he was there. After it, the whole thing is flummoxed for a variety of reasons. What evidence do we really have that he was absolutely there? Well, okay, we do have, and everyone can choose not to accept any or all of this, but we do have a transit visa application that the Cubans collected from him with his picture on it. Okay? There's no doubt about that is there. There are all doubts about the picture, although the sweater in the picture was shown to have been in his possession. Marina had not ever seen that picture before. She recognized the clothing when she was asked about it. What other evidence do we have? There were a variety of little bits and pieces of normal tourist type things that you would carry back from Mexico to Texas, including a gift for Marina. He didn't disguise the fact that he had been in Mexico from her. Now, again, you can choose not to believe her, and you can believe all those little bits and trinkets and, souvenir trash that you carry back from your trip and throw away after, a couple of months was all planted afterwards. I mean, but that you would have to believe that all of those little bits and pieces were collected and planted after the fact. So I guess that's part of the problem. What we don't have for any tourist, let's just say it was you. I've been to Mexico. Mm-hmm. Can I prove that I was there? Because I still kept the tourist trash. Okay, I keep everything. But we're asking, where are the pictures? Where are the tapes? It's really kind of unusual to ask for that level of verification, especially when Oswald was interviewed. Mm-hmm. And when Marina was interviewed after the assassination, the interviewers are asking both of them about Mexico. It's not like nobody knew about Mexico hours later. Mexico was an established fact. All this confusion and it just happens after the fact. But in the hours after the assassination, there was absolutely no doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald had been in Mexico. What was in doubt was what was going on around him in Mexico. That's what Hoover was worried about. It's like, was somebody impersonating him doing things there? That's what, like over the weekend, you and I both know the real worry about Oswald was in Mexico came from the Gilberto Alvarado story, which says it's coming from a CIA source saying he was here for real. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. And he took money to kill the president. And our source says that he heard him. And he has so much detail. He can describe the girl that talked to him, the man that talked to him. He can give you the name off her passport. He can tell you where she lives. That's what was worrying Washington, D.C. in like the days after the assassination, because that's explosive.
Right. So,
and Mexico City was supporting it. Think about this. Again, at the time, the ambassador, the CIA station chief, and David Phillips were all supporting that story. And David Phillips would go on to support that story even in his testimony to the HSCA and even in multiple books he wrote after the fact. So again, we're faced with, we want proof, whereas, those guys just wanted to use it.
Right. So, look, we've gone almost an hour here, okay? And I know it's easy to do because there is so much packed into this and so much to question. I think it's an adequate point to actually stop and say, okay, look, we have established here Oswald is in Mexico City. Now, as for what he did, we started to cover that. But what does this all mean? How did it come out, and how does it come out after the assassination? The back and forth. Hoover's asking questions of the CIA. He doesn't feel like they're being straight with him. I think all of that is what we should cover the next time we get together. And
I would put that all under just like the title that you just gave. The CIA lied to us about Mexico City.
There you go.
Which is what Hoover said. And that's something we can absolutely run through and is responsible. what we cannot do is we cannot trust the information that the CIA provided after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
Before the fact is not an issue, but the stuff that's why the HSCA actually concluded that they could not. They were satisfied that Oswald had been at the consulate and the embassy.
Right.
They were not satisfied with how he got there, the details of his movements necessarily, in and around the embassies and consulates. That they were satisfied that he was there, but they did not trust what the CIA was giving them for the rest of the story. And they were right not to trust that. And one of the reasons for that is it's not just this. What we have to remember is in Mexico City,
mm-hmm.
the relationship between the CIA and the Mexican police was something amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you throw in the CIA telling the Mexican police what to do, which they did, like arrest Iran and keep her incommunicado, then you have to raise the issue of what else did they interfere with? Did they control what travel records, bus records, hotel records? Was any of that, managed? Because it really all came through the Mexican police.
And that's where we have to go next.
The FBI can't do that. They have to work with the Mexican police. So
right.
There's every reason to suspect that. What I'm not trying to do is come down and say we fully understand where Oswald was and how he got there and everything that happened, because there's good reason to question some of that data which is inconsistent, in that came from the Mexicans themselves.
Right.
It could have been inconsistent because of their record keeping. Quite honestly, their record keeping not all that fantastic, or by the DFS interference, like the CIA says we need this. We need you go collect a consistent set of travel documents so nobody raises any questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, right. What do we have to erase? What do we have? Yeah. So I think if you just we can't trust the CIA in Mexico City is the next step.
No, absolutely true. And I think we got to begin the next time you and I get together with the bus trip, because here's the problem right away. You'd think, okay, let's figure out how the guy got here. Did he take public, something akin to a public transit? Was somebody giving him a ride straight there? I mean, how did he get there, right? And the answer we start with there, it begins the problems, doesn't it?
It absolutely begins the problem. And I'm not going to say that it's possible to resolve that problem. I think that we don't know how he got there. I think there are internal conflicts in the information. One of the things that there were internal contradictions, even if you go back to the first days, the newspaper stories after the first couple of weeks, you'll find a couple of stories. One story from a passport agent, U.S. passport agent at the Mexican border,
right?
Who says, "Oh, he came across with other people."
Right.
I remember it well. He wasn't by himself. Another one says, "Oh yeah, I saw him. He left in a car with other people." And it's kind of in a way reminds you the fact. It reminds me of what we encounter in the school book depository when the school book depository company manager says, "Oh, I saw Oswald right there in the entryway of the book depository right at the time of the shooting." Oh, okay. And you never see that story. That's in the first day paper out of Dallas, and you never see that story again, right? You never see these passport agent stories again. So we have to also cope with the fact that, there are bits and pieces that don't support the official story that just vanish.
Well, right. And the thing is, that you would think it would be very simple when you have such a highly, again, surveilled area. Mexico City especially, a highly surveilled area. You got the CIA definitely having its interest. I mean, we have a station there that is highly active, well-staffed, right? all of this going on, and the FBI should have access to things. We have a cozy relationship with, as you said, the Mexican authorities. This should not be.
At least the CIA does. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We should have. Yeah, yeah. I'm not disagreeing with that at all. We should have all sorts of stuff that we don't have. We should have, and the fact that we don't, to me, is a reflection on questions that have to be asked about the CIA,
right?
And things that were going on, and why we wouldn't have this information. What they have to protect, what they have to suppress, what they have to obfuscate. And to bring one point forward, which kind of is a segue for us, is we have documents themselves from the CIA that says you people in Mexico City cannot do certain things because the one thing that we cannot risk is exposing the extent of our own operation in Mexico City. So one of the things that we have to deal with is their number one charter. Quite frankly, I hate to say this, it doesn't seem to me like it was the assassination of the president. It was protecting their operations, whether they're surveillance or political action or dirty tricks or relation with the Mexican president. I mean, if you surfaced information on this surveillance operation and this central switching center that exposed the Mexican president, you could have a diplomatic nightmare, with the communists in Mexico quite ready to take advantage of the whole situation. So anyway, we've got the CIA has its own motives and its own agendas.
Right. And then we have to tackle the interaction between the FBI and the CIA because here we go. Hoover, again, with just having dropped that whole alert on Oswald just before this happens. Strange timing there, right? So I think we got to open up with the trip to Mexico City yet again, but from a different angle. Okay, he's there, but we got to figure out where he stayed, how he got there, and all of that. And I think we should do that in 2 weeks from now. Will be good for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And just one final comment, the last thing. The difference that we can note between the FBI and the CIA, everybody that, if you examine it after the fact, almost everybody that screwed up with the FBI got sent to Boise or otherwise disciplined in some fashion. Nobody that screwed up with the CIA got disciplined in any fashion. I always think that's kind of interesting. Did anybody get in trouble for the malfunctioning cameras? Did anybody get in trouble for the tapes that allegedly disappeared? Did anybody? Seems like no. So what does that indicate? Maybe you're gonna write your own internal memo that says David Phillips, the head of your counterintelligence activities in Mexico City, didn't know what was going on with any of this, so you can't trust him. Shouldn't David Phillips have gotten downgraded?
If he doesn't know what's happening, I would say that, since one of your primary jobs would be to check on who's going to the Russian and Cuban, facilities, and you have, our cameras didn't work. Whoops, we got the wrong guy. We're not sure where the tapes went. I don't know. Sounds to me like either that was the job that they were supposed to do, in which case, of course, there's no discipline. Mixing things up was what they were supposed to do, or there's something else happening here. But anyway, we'll leave that for 2 weeks from now.
We'll try to go further. Let's see how far we can go.
And I honestly don't know how far we can go with it, but we will see and see if we can figure out if he was actually on the bus or what happened. And see if we can track and trace a guy who should have shown up like a sore thumb. Again.
One of the things that we will be able to do for those that are listening, so that it's we will be able to tell a whole lot more about what was going on inside the CIA. We may not know a lot more about the bus ride, but we know a lot more about what was going inside Mexico City Station and at headquarters and actually at JM Wave. which will become a big part of the story.
Oh, yeah. Well, gee, I wonder why that is. But we're going to find out. And also, I think we shouldn't gloss over too quickly the whole thing with the Mexican police and their role in a few different things that occur here. And in the aftermath of it, and trying to see about people's testimony and all that kind of good stuff. And can we track down people? Who do we have arrested or taken into custody, I should say properly, right? Yeah. And why? Okay. Also contradictions. And people bring this up all the time, and used to be very popular in the documentaries, Larry, as you well know. The idea that people are describing different people being Oswald in these places. I mean, at one point, I don't know, no picture do I see of Lee Harvey Oswald where you can say, he looks like a very light blonde-haired guy. Doesn't work, And one description, the funny thing is, one of those mismatched descriptions does look a lot like the guy who we get the photographs of that they call the Mystery Man, right? Somebody actually
gave at the Russian embassy.
At the Russian embassy. Although, where were the pictures taken?
The pictures were taken at the Russian embassy.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, you have pictures taken there of this guy who's clearly not Lee Harvey Oswald, and this is the guy they describe as Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah, oh, yeah. And I think we can get into the fact that seems to have been done for a purpose. See, one of the problems is that where we get convoluted, things that were done for a purpose before the assassination assume an entirely new context after. Something that you did that was perfectly acceptable, nobody was ever going to know about. This is tradecraft, this is practice, it's internal, that made perfect sense before the assassination. After the assassination is a problem.
Yep.
Explain it, because if you explain it, you expose what you do. And we have to accept that is always an issue. Do we prefer to look stupid, or do we prefer to expose ourselves? And by the way, what does my boss think about that? Would my boss prefer that I just look like an idiot, or I blow apart his whole operation? Oh, by the way, and one of the things that we will be talking about in regard to Duran and others is there were serious ongoing operations with several of these people in the Cuban consulate that were fully live at the time of the assassination and after the assassination. Right. So, again, we have to deal with the fact that, as I said, Hoover did, but he didn't really have ongoing operations. So he can discipline anybody when he wants, whenever he wants. The CIA is in a bit of a different boat, with especially some of their dirty tricks, blackmail operations.
Right. Right, and that's the other fun thing is that also with the CIA, just as a teaser here, sometimes you have to implant some disinformation in certain operations because you intend for some of it to get exposed to a party that, you might, in a one-dimensional sense, think, well, this party should never, ever get a hold of this information. But you might intentionally plant disinformation in an information stream. And indeed, pictures of somebody that are definitely not that person could be useful if you're trying to mislead someone. Just saying. Okay. Yeah. Hypothetically, Larry. And we'll continue this discussion in 2 weeks with Larry Hancock. But once again, if you go to larry-hancock.com, you'll be able to follow Larry's work. But we're also looking forward to a book-length manuscript on, which, by the way, is it going to be completely published into a book? Are we sure of that yet? Or
oh yeah, it's definitely a book. It's in edit now. It will be a book. I don't know how long it will be when it's all told, but probably somewhere between 230 and 250 pages.
Right, and it's a new look at Oswald, and this may play a major role. What we're talking about tonight may play a major role in part of the book, but this is not going to be the whole thing. Just letting you guys know that, this is going to be an interesting reevaluation, a reexamination, and a different appraisal, if you will, of the historical figure that is Lee Harvey Oswald. Anything you want to say before we cut this off for now? And like I
think we'll look forward to next week. We can't, as we always can, we can't answer every question. Or if we could, this would have been cleared up a long time ago. But I think one of the things that we'll be able to draw out in the conversation is maybe a better understanding of why we can't. What has made this so complex and so confusing and raise so many questions? And part of it we've discussed tonight. Either somebody wasn't doing their job at all, or there's more going on here than meets the eye. And what we need to talk about is there's probably more going on than meets the eye. And it's better to look stupid than fill in the blank.
Well, right. And I suspect that when it comes to the CIA, much like with many other failures of intelligence, right, that occur in other circumstances, it seems to me like, it's acceptable to appear incompetent briefly, so long as your bosses know what's really going on. It doesn't matter if on the surface it looks incompetent, ridiculous, as if somebody didn't do their job, because maybe they were doing their job. And
that's the difference. Yeah. The CIA plays the long game always, which I hate. The FBI tends to play short games.
Right.
But the CIA always plays these long, complex games. And along the way, if they blow apart at any point, it's very embarrassing. But they're always looking at long games.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the long game, like I said, I think we're gonna start with the bus trip. And oh, by the way, what about the FBI and what was it that they were figuring out regarding this, and so on and so forth. So I think we'll start there next time we get together. But in the meantime, this is going to be a continuing conversation. I look forward to. And by the way, I've gotten a little peek at some of what Larry has written regarding this, and I can't wait to see the whole thing done because it's going to be.
Me too.
Yeah. I think you just want to get it finished. But but to me, this is going to be a brand new and unique furtherance of the study when it comes to the historical figure known as Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, are we going to solve the assassination with this? Maybe not, but I think we're going to get a more honest appraisal once again of the historical character that we know as Lee Harvey Oswald. I think there's been some mistakes made due to the lack of information in some cases and due to people cozying up to certain pieces of information and refusing to look at the rest, the entirety, the context, if you will. But that's never a problem for Larry Hancock. Anyway, the Ochelli Effect is done for tonight. Like I said, we'll get back together with Larry in 2 weeks, but I'll be back tomorrow night with more. Anyway, Larry-Hancock.com. I highly recommend all of his books. Read them, follow Larry, and you'll hear from him again in 2 weeks on this show.
WallStreetWindow.com. Gold, silver, the stock market. WallStreetWindow.com. Perhaps you're invested deeply. Perhaps you're not in deep enough. Maybe you're thinking about getting started. WallStreetWindow.com. Michael Swanson, the brilliant author of The War State, understood these trends professionally for many years, and now he gives you the benefit of his knowledge. WallStreetWindow.com. Go there now. Go there now. Go there now.
This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and you're listening to The Ochelli Effect at Ochelli.com.
The views expressed by callers, co-hosts, or anyone else who happens to get on the air at Ochelli.com do not necessarily reflect the views of Ochelli.com or Chuck Ochelli, and we are not responsible for any stupidity which might ensue. Thank you.
Ochelli.com.
Go ahead, caller.
I'm interested in the truth about the JFK assassination.
Right, well, what do you want to know?
Judy Baker's wild claim, Oswald girlfriend, he knew Ruby and Barry, cancer weapons. Really?
I imagine I could claim I have 4 wheels. It doesn't make me a wagon, but okay.
Oswald was on the kill team and trying to prevent the murder of John Kennedy. Come on now, has it real expert on the JFK assassination, look into her claims.
Go to Amazon.com, enter Judith Baker in her own words. You'll get results for a digital copy of a book where Walt Brown utilizes her own words and the known evidence in the case to get at, well, a different perspective, let's say. You can get Judith Barry Baker in her own words from the author himself, signed if you request it by contacting Dr. Brown at KIASJFK@AOL.com. It's a fun book and it actually dissects the many, many fantastic claims. Judith Barry Baker in her own words.
Thank you for all the great information.
In Denial, Secret Wars with Airstrikes and Tanks by Larry Hancock. Secret wars became a staple of U.S. covert operations and are still happening today. Larry Hancock's book, In Denial, rips the cover off many of them. Using new files, it exposes things about the Bay of Pigs that no one has ever written about before. It shows why it really failed and why the United States did not learn from it. It also shows why other countries today are doing secret operations with more success. This is the book that puts what some want to deny into the light. In Denial, Secret Wars with Airstrikes and Tanks. Larry Hancock. For more information, go to larry-hancock.com. Pick up your copy of In Denial at Amazon.com in digital or physical form.